the southern portion of Boston Harbor, there's a ledge, a reef, that's known as Minot's Ledge. According to historians, this particular area has been very dangerous for ships. In fact, I read that more shipwrecks that have occurred in Boston Harbor occurred down around this area on Minot's Ledge. In 1849, they constructed a lighthouse on this ledge. However, it didn't last long because in 1851 it was destroyed in a violent storm. And so a second lighthouse was built, the one that's currently there. But what made this lighthouse especially popular occurred in 1894 when the United States adopted a policy to assign to each particular lighthouse their own pattern of lights. And so this one received the 1-4-3 pattern, which is one flash separated by 3 seconds, and then 4 flashes separated only by a second each, and then another 3-second break before the final sequence would begin. 3 flashes, 1 second in between each one. The assistant lighthouse keeper, Winfield Scott Thompson, lived across the bay from Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. And so when he would go into work in the evenings, his wife and children would live in their house across the bay, and they would see this pattern of this light flashing across the harbor. And Thompson's wife told his children as she was tucking them into bed each evening that you can look out across the bay and you can see that flashing light. That is your father telling you, I love you. So Minot's Ledge Lighthouse became known as the I Love You Lighthouse. When you turn and begin reading in the book of Ruth, especially as you come towards the end of the first chapter, the passage that Emmanuel read for us this morning, and you see the reaction of Naomi as she finally returns to Bethlehem after her sojourn in Moab, and you hear her response as the women of the town greet her that Naomi is back. And she tells them, don't call me Naomi any longer. Naomi, you might like to know, means pleasant. Naomi said, I'd like to go by the name Mara, bitter, because the Lord has afflicted me. When I think about that lighthouse as it's flashing its symbol across the bay, I get the feeling that Naomi didn't get the note that God loved her. Well, perhaps more to the point, that note was buried under an avalanche of affliction. And so when you turn to the book of Ruth and you begin to read through the story, you realize fairly quickly that the book of Ruth is a story of suffering. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that we're talking about the kind of suffering like perhaps Job went through, but to Naomi it was especially intense and bitter. The minds of many people today are upon the events that occurred 15 years ago today. and the idea of a nation being under attack. Today, 15 years later, while we do recognize the possibility of a terrorist attack, perhaps on this scale or even greater, for Christians, the greater danger and greater threat is the culture that is turned against us. A culture that no longer values God, respects His Word, and upholds the standards that we find within it. We don't know what the future, of course, will hold for our nation, for Christianity in our nation. But we do know that we have a strength that we can hold on to God. When you read the story of Naomi, and when you take a walk with her through her world, you can begin to experience this idea of isolation. Has God abandoned us? Has God forsaken us? First of all, the story is set in the days of the judges. Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. Well, the days of the judges were days that were so evil that the inspired writer of the book of Judges said on 2 occasions, in Judges 17 and verse 6, and then again in Judges 21 and verse 25, that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. When you have a society whose only standard of right and wrong is what feels good at the moment, who's not anchored to a biblical morality, who does not uphold faith in God, then only hardship and trouble is going to follow. As you read down through the book of Ruth, we see that she also had to deal with a famine that was so severe that throughout Israel there became a scarcity of food. And so her husband Elimelech and her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, came to the conclusion that if they were going to survive, they needed to migrate to Moab. Now, that is a tremendous decision that reveals their sense of hopelessness. The Moabites are descendants of Lot. And as you read in the earlier chapters of the book of Judges, chapter 3, verses 12 through 30, we learn that the Moabites were among the first of the surrounding nations during that extended period of the Judges who took advantage of Israel and oppressed them. For 18 years, the writer tells us, Israel was oppressed by the Moabites until finally they were delivered by one of the first judges. And then we come to verse 3 of chapter 1. And Elimelech dies. And then we come to verse 5. And Mahlon dies. And Chilion dies. And then Ruth and Naomi and Orpah decide that they need to return to Israel. But Naomi does not want to bring along her daughter-in-laws, and so she encourages them to go back home. And as she is explaining to them about her particular state of hopelessness, she says in verse 13, "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And there you have it, Naomi's sense of hopelessness. God has abandoned me. God has forsaken me. I am completely alone. and life is hopeless. Naomi lived in a world of suffering. She lived in a world where she felt she was abandoned by God. She lived in a world where her life became hopeless, so much so that she wanted to no longer be recognized as Naomi. Bitter was her life, and bitter was her name. But the book of Ruth is also a book about strength. It's a story of strength. It's a strength that can be summarized in verse 14 of chapter 1, when Naomi is encouraging her daughter-in-laws to go back to their mother's homes, to pick up their lives without her the best they can. Orpah obeys. But in verse 14, the writer said, "But Ruth clung to her." But those who read the book of Ruth can see something even deeper in that phrase. For in Naomi, Ruth had come to know God. And while Naomi may have thought that God has forsaken her, that God has abandoned her, that she's all alone and hopeless, Ruth's faith never seems to waver. It's in her strength that the story of the book of Ruth continues. And so they came to Bethlehem in the time of the barley harvest. And in verse 2 of chapter 2, Ruth expressed a desire to Naomi that she be permitted to go and to glean in the fields. Ruth has come to know that according to the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, the harvesters in the field were not permitted to go back and to re-harvest any particular field. But they were to leave the grains that were left behind and whatever could be salvaged from the stalks for the poor. And so Ruth knew that there would be women out there among the poor who would be gleaning behind the harvesters. She asked permission from her mother-in-law to be permitted to go. In verse 3 of chapter 2, we're told that she happened to come upon the field of Boaz. She happened to. But when you look at the story as a whole, we understand that perhaps that wasn't so much luck as it was providence that she happened upon the field of Boaz. The workers of the field, when questioned by Boaz, recognized Ruth as a woman of strength. And in verse 12, Boaz recognized her faith. And at the end of the day, when Ruth took home the fruits of her labors, and she presented those to Naomi, an amazing thing begins to transpire. That faith that Naomi seemed to have abandoned when she returned to Bethlehem, that feeling of being forsaken that drove her to adopt a new name, a new persona that reflected her lot in life, that old faith began to flicker. And new life begins to come into Naomi. And in chapter 2 and verse 20, I think perhaps one of the most beautiful verses in the whole story of Ruth is when Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and to the dead. That feeling of hopelessness begins to dissipate as Naomi's faith reignites. And then we see two things that happen that are not necessarily spelled out as clearly, I think, in the book of Ruth as they are in the Levitical law of Moses. One was the idea of the levirate marriage. The levirate marriage is discussed in Deuteronomy chapter 25, beginning in verse 5 and following, and it is derived from the Latin term lever, which means husband's brother. But the law of Moses had provisions so that the families of Israel could retain a continuity, and so that a man's name within the tribal heritage of Israel could live on beyond him. And so the idea of levirate marriage, it's probably most familiar to us from the discussion that takes place in Matthew 22, when the Jewish leaders are trying to entrap Jesus in his words, and they come to him with this made-up supposition. What happens if there are 7 brothers who marry a woman, and each of the brothers dies without having offspring by that woman? In the resurrection of the dead, they ask, whose wife will she be? That is the idea of levirate marriage. And so when a woman becomes a widow without children, without a male child, without an heir, then her closest relative would assume the role of the husband, bear a child that would continue the legacy of the husband. The other idea is the idea of the kinsman redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer was the nearest male relative who could buy back land that was sold within the heritage of Israel, who could perform the role of a husband to a widow who has no children, who could buy back an Israelite who sells himself into slavery. And so when we come to the book of Ruth and we see that evening scene where Ruth is presenting the fruit of her labors to Naomi, and she's describing to Naomi the events that are taking place, and we see this faith begin to revive within Naomi as she starts thinking about God's provisions in the law, and a plan begins to form in her mind. The story of Ruth is also a story of success. It begins sadly, but the ending of the book of Ruth is nothing short of victorious. And so we take a walk through Boaz's world. Boaz found the love of his life in chapter 3. In chapter 4, as he carried out the provisions that were made within God's law, Boaz found the joy that comes from obedience to God. Boaz found the joy of a child born. He saw the faith that was restored to Naomi. He became the great-grandfather of David. And perhaps of most importance, he found a place within the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew chapter 1. The book of Ruth reminds us that God has provisions within his word that can sustain us through the difficult times of life. The fact of the matter is, God does not shield Christians from adversity or hardship. But God has provisions for strength, to hold on to grow, to mature. God has provisions within His Word that enable us to go through those difficult times of life without abandoning our faith. And even if the difficulties of life do get us down, and we feel like Naomi, that God has abandoned us, that we're all alone in the world, God's provisions give us the church, a family, a strength when we're weak, encouragement when we waver. God has made provisions for us in our life. And like in the book of Ruth, we learn that faith can banish hopelessness. Yes, life can be difficult. Yes, we can find afflictions that threaten to bring us down. But if we will live in the faith of God's promises and God's law, we can have a trust that can withstand anything that life throws at us. God does not forsake us in times of trial. Like Minot's Ledge Lighthouse, that every night sends out that message of love. The message of God's love is beamed out even brighter through the cross of Jesus and through His empty tomb. The message is inescapable. God loves us. If you doubt that, then read through the Gospels and read through what God allowed His Son to endure for no other reason than He loves you. And so the question this morning is, do you love God? And that cannot be answered by words in a place such as this. The answer to that question can only be given by how we live, how we speak, how we act every day of our lives. We have the opportunity and privilege of reflecting God's light of love and letting God know how much we love Him through obeying His Son. So this morning, how is your relationship with Jesus? Have you allowed the hardships of life to bury your faith, to keep you from obeying? This morning you have the opportunity to come to God through Jesus, to embrace Him in baptism, to share in His death, His burial, His resurrection, to rise from the waters of baptism and to walk a new life in Jesus. This morning we have the opportunity as Christians to remove the obstacles that have come between us and God, that have allowed life to obscure and block God's love from radiating through us and reflecting to others. If the cares of this world are keeping you from serving God as a Christian the way that you should, why not this morning remove those barriers? Let nothing stand between you and your Lord. Let your life be a beacon that tells the world just how much God loves them. So whatever your need might be this morning to respond to the Lord's invitation, we want to be here to encourage and help you if we can, if you'll come while we stand and sing.